Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, December the 2nd, 2025. A few weeks ago, we had the intellectual historian Laura Field on the show talking about the intelligence of the MAGA intelligentsia. She has a new book out, Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. And we talked about characters like Patrick Deneen, Christopher Rufo, Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance. We talked about their intellectual originality and vitality. Certainly they seem to be dominating the debate these days. But I wonder whether the question we asked about the smartness of this new intelligentsia was the wrong question. We have an excellent piece in The Atlantic by an old friend of the show and one of my old friends, Pete Wehner, The Intellectual and Moral Decline of the American Right. And Pete is joining us today. Pete, do you think there's something, and I use this word carefully given you're a religious man, sacrilegious about asking, and this isn't a critique of Laura, in fact, it's a critique of me for putting this kind of title on our conversation, to wonder about the intelligence of the new right?
Yeah, I don't think it's sacrilegious. I think it's a legitimate question to pose. I don't think it's the right question, or at least it's the right question maybe. But I'd say the answer doesn't have to do with intelligence, because you have very smart people who are pro MAGA, and in fact, I would argue that sometimes high intelligence makes the situation worse, because people who have high intelligence have the capacity to construct rationalizations and justifications for awful behavior, awful things that maybe the rest of us don't have. I think about it more, Andrew, through a psychological prism, and in some respects through a moral prism, and I wouldn't separate the two. I think they're linked. So it's a fair question to ask. It's an interesting question to answer.
Do you think, though, that characters like Deneen and Thiel, who are clearly smart, I mean, whether you agree with them or not, even J.D. Vance, do you think they're aware of those inconsistencies? You talk about psychology. They're not self-psychologizers or self-analytical, perhaps, in that sense. But do you think they consciously suppress or redirect their intelligence for their ideological goals?
I suspect they do, and I suspect it's a human tendency. None of us lives easily with cognitive dissonance, the sense that we are living at odds with our deepest beliefs or deepest values. We like to think ourselves of a certain type, and if there's evidence from others, from ourselves, that we're living in contradiction to that, we want to silence those voices, because it's not comfortable, unless you're sociopathic. It's not comfortable to live that way. So I think what happens, my experience of what's happened, is that at first they know that they're playing a game, and then they justify the game, right? So one classic justification would have been early on in the Trump era, look, we're gonna go along to get along, because at key moments we'll be able to check his worst tendencies. And so there's a price to pay for that, but it's really for the greater good, for the common good. So I think that's how it starts. I think over time people accommodate themselves to behavior that's unethical, immoral, transgressive. And at some point, whatever that voice was that was speaking to you, saying that this isn't right, this isn't really what you stood for in the past, it isn't what you should stand for now, that voice gets silenced, pushed away, locked away in some part of our mind. And then you become animated, vivified by whatever it is that the movement that you're a part of. And that may be hatred, it may be anger, it may be vengeance, maybe a lot of dark emotion. So I think it's a complicated question. And again, I think all of us to some degree battle that. And I think all of us to some degree rationalize not just our behavior, but our beliefs. We become invested either in the behavior or the beliefs. And so it can be painful to disinvest.
As I said, your new piece, as always, excellent reading, important reading, Pete, The Intellectual and Moral Decline of the American Right. Is it fair to say, though, that the right has the vitality these days. You've written also critiques of the left. You wrote an excellent piece a couple of years ago in the New York Times with your friend and partner, John Rausch, who is also a frequent guest on the show, about the intellectual bankruptcy in some ways of the left. But would it be fair to say, for better or worse, that the right, and particularly the radical right, is dominating intellectual discourse in America these days?
Yeah, I disagree with your question a little bit in terms of the energy of the right. I think there's no question that that's been the case for several years now. It partly explains how Trump won in 2024, because turnout was high for Republicans, it was low for Democrats, and there was an unquestionable degree of a torpor and depression, sense of powerlessness among Democrats, internal feuding in the months after Trump was inaugurated. I'd say that that's changed in probably the last 6 weeks, when you had some of these elections in Virginia, New Jersey, and Georgia, and elsewhere,
and New York, of course,
and New York, of course. Of course, New York is one you'd expect to go Democratic. It was interesting. I live in the state of Virginia, and that was a total sweep of Democrats at every level. And not just the Democrats won, but they won by really significant margins, including in districts that should have been close. And there's an interesting race happening in Tennessee. Now, I don't think the Democrat will win there, but this is a district that Trump won by 22 points in 2024. And I imagine it's going to be a good deal closer. And now you're beginning to see the early signs of if not a crack up exactly, of certainly internal tensions within MAGA world, where prominent personalities, podcasters, radio talk show hosts, and others are going at each other hammer and tong. And the mood of the Democrats is much more energized, and the polling right now is very much in their favor. In terms of intellectual dominance, yeah, I think that the idea is, I mean, I'd almost put quotation marks around intellectual for what is or constitutes, represents the MAGA right. But the ideas that they're pushing have certainly driven the conversation. Their ideas are dominating in American politics. And I'd say the left and the Democratic Party just intellectually is pretty lifeless right now. It's not clear to me, and I don't think it's clear to a lot of them, what they stand for, what the overarching narrative, what the deep principles are, and what the policy implications of those principles are. Now, that's not entirely unusual, because they're the party out of power, and that has to sort itself out. It should sort itself out to some degree once you get to the next election. But yeah, right now, the MAGA right, populism, and for several years, really for 10 years more or less, with exceptions, has dominated.
Yeah, and I think where there is interesting developments on the left is on the abundance left. That's probably a conversation for another show.
I agree with that.
Pete, in your piece, the Atlantic piece on the intellectual and moral decline of the American right, you focus on the Tucker Carlson interview with Nick Fuentes from a few weeks ago.
Right.
The Carlson podcast is number 6. It has many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of views, and listeners and viewers are all loyal, presumably relatively sympathetic to Carlson and perhaps Fuentes. You noted also the beginnings of a fragmentation of the MAGA movement. Is this interview interesting because it triggered a fragmentation, or is it interesting because Carlson, a relatively mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream journalist, put this neo-Nazi on his show, Fuentes?
Yeah, I'd say it's interesting for both those reasons. I mean, it is interesting given the arc of Tucker Carlson's career. I mean, I'd say he's no longer mainstream. I think he moved into the extremist lane a couple of years ago.
Well, maybe extremism is mainstream these days, Pete.
Well, that's right. I mean, yes, in the sense, but then I would put him in at least the general zip code of Nick Fuentes. Now, Fuentes and Carlson are mainstreamed in some respects. That I would argue is the problem. But my point is that Tucker Carlson, who started out early in his journalistic career at the Weekly Standard, and was a quote unquote normal Republican, Reagan Republican, Bush Republican. And then he was on Fox, and he began this move toward the populist right. But that wasn't the most disturbing thing. I think what was most disquieting was that he got into some of these weird conspiracy theories, and it's just an odd person and personality, but significant and certainly popular. And so having Nick Fuentes on, who is an outspoken white supremacist, neo-Nazi, has had favorable things to say about Hitler, has talked about how women enjoy rape. I mean, this guy is really, his language and his worldview are trashy and dark, very, very dark. And to have Tucker Carlson platform him and essentially celebrate him, that's important. You have to pay attention to that. I think for too long, Andrew, people on the right in the Republican Party comforted themselves thinking that, these are just fringe movements. They'll never spread. And so way too many people were quiet way too early. And to this day, many of them, including as I wrote about Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation, not only wouldn't speak up, but actually defended Carlson. And
that's where the split came, or one of the splits, where the Heritage Foundation CEO or president defended Carlson and then was attacked by many people on the right and within the Heritage Foundation. My question, Pete, I mean, your piece is on the intellectual and moral decline of the American right. But when you look at certainly someone like Fuentes, it seems to me to be more of a product of Monty Python than of the beer halls of Berlin or the beer halls of Munich of the early 20s. I mean, explain this man in intellectual terms, and I use that word carefully. Isn't he just a clown? And aren't most of these people parodies of clowns?
I think they are. A clown is the descriptor that I've used before, and I would certainly use now. And I don't think Nick Fuentes is within 1,000 light years of being an intellectual. He's a shock jock. He lives to offend the sensibilities. He doesn't know very much about very much at all. But he doesn't care to know. So in ways, he's the antithesis of an intellectual. He's an anti-intellectual. Tucker Carlson's in a different category. Tucker is well-read and reasonably intelligent, but it is significant that he's now playing footsie and platforming these clowns, and he has now become de facto a clown too, but a malicious clown, a malevolent clown, and that matters. But that was the point I was trying to make in the essay, which is not that these people are intellectuals, but that it's the intellectual and moral decline of the right. The right, remember, in conservatism, was a serious intellectual movement when I was formed by it and shaped by it in the 1980s. People may have disagreed. You probably disagreed with it at the time, but there were serious thinkers, people like James Q. Wilson and George Kelly and Alan Bloom, Irving Kristol, people like that, George Will, the columnist, and many others, people who started the Public Interest, the magazine, which was a neoconservative magazine. And there were really serious debates. I remember talking to somebody who was in Congress at the time, I guess, and he was saying that sort of essentially that the left and progressives outnumbered or outmanned the right in terms of the cultural institutions that they had control over, but that this person felt confident going into any debate, any dialogue, any conversation, because it felt like there was intellectual heft to the conservative worldview. And that influenced people like me. It influenced people like Yuval Levin and David Brooks and Mike Gerson and David French and many others who looked up to these people and learned from them. So there was a certain pride, confidence in the intellectual caliber of conservatism, the conservatism of Burke, the conservatism of Madison, and figures like that, Oakeshott. Now there's absolutely no interest in these ideas. They've turned, to the degree they're even familiar with these people or their ideas, they've turned against them. But mostly it's just a sense that we don't care. This is a game. This is a clown show. This is about power. This is about shock and outrage. And that is a terrible thing for the Republican Party, for the I don't even call it the conservative movement, for the American right. But it's worse for the country because they're the dominant force right now, and they're tearing down the country, not just themselves.
Pete, a few weeks ago, we had Charles Murray on the show. I know he's a friend of yours, the author of The Bell Curve. Very controversial book, very controversial writer. There were those people on the left in particular who were enormously critical of Murray's Bell Curve when he came out, seeing it as a kind of disguised racist argument for the superiority of whites over blacks, men over women, blah, blah, blah. There will be people on the left who will say, well, Fuentes and Carlson, they're simply being a little bit more honest than people like Charles Murray. And I'm not suggesting that you and David French and your other moral conservatives were all secret racists. But could one argue that what these people are now saying, the Carlsons and the Fuentes of the world, are simply saying in public what some conservatives felt but didn't have the nerve, the audacity to say in public?
Yeah, I'd rise in defense of Charles Murray to this extent. I think it's important to say. One can disagree, of course.
It was a dangerous book, though, Pete, wasn't it?
Well, it catalyzed a debate that was unfortunate in some respects, and a lot of people pushed back against it on the merits of the case. And Charles and Dick Herrnstein made their case for it. I wish the book hadn't been written. I don't think it was particularly helpful, but that's not a secret to Charles. And a lot of people who know Charles and like him and admire him for a lot of his work, from welfare to human achievement to other things that he's done, felt like that wasn't needed or wasn't necessary. That said, I take your point, and I wouldn't dispute it. In fact, I would underscore it. I do think that there were elements on the American right that existed that, as you said, it wasn't said out loud, but it existed. And I'll give you an example of that. There was an interview that Lee Atwater gave in 1981, and it wasn't revealed until, I think, the late 80s or 1990s. It may have been The Nation magazine, or it might have been Mother Jones.
And Atwater, of course, was very influential in marketing Bush Sr., wasn't he?
And Reagan.
And
Reagan. And remember, this interview took place in 81, so this was when Reagan had just won. And what was interesting about that interview was that there was a discussion about the so-called Southern strategy that Richard Nixon and other Republicans used in the 60s. And, a lot of people argued that the case that Nixon and others made was a legitimate case about law and order, and to bring comity to the cities and peace to the cities. And that liberals who were saying, well, this is just coded language to appeal to racist sentiments in primarily the South, but not only the South, and that this was a cynical game being played by Republicans. Now, a lot of people, including me, said, look, that's not a fair charge. There's a case to be made, for law and order, and it's not necessarily a call to racist ears, kind of code language. But Lee Atwater said it was, and Lee Atwater was such an influential political strategist, and he said we couldn't use the N-word, so we had to come up with other language, and it was the language of the Southern strategy. So I remember when that came out, and made me rethink, like, man, maybe I was wrong to defend that if Lee Atwater's saying it. Now, you can also go to figures like Pat Buchanan, who was another, I think, dark force in American politics. He uh, was a very influential writer for decades on the American right, worked in the Reagan administration, and he was part of what's called a paleoconservative movement. And if you want to think about the paleoconservative movement, think about Lincoln and the Civil War. Most of us are great champions of Lincoln and glad that the North won the war. The paleoconservatives, not so much. They refer to it as the War of the States. They think it was a war of northern aggression, and they think Lincoln was, in many ways, a negative force in American life. Buchanan came from that movement. And if you really want to understand the intellectual pedigree of the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself, and to the degree that Trump cares about ideas or his movement does, you really do need to go back to Buchanan. If you look at the platform Buchanan ran in 1992 when he challenged George H.W. Bush, it is almost identical to what Trump has adopted. And remember, one other thing that's relevant here is that Bill Buckley, who was the editor of National Review at the time, was a giant figure within conservatism and in American politics, basically made the judgment that Pat Buchanan was guilty of anti-Semitism. And
Buckley himself had a spotted record on anti-Semitism anyway. So coming from someone who wasn't particularly close to the Jewish community, that was quite an accusation.
Yeah. So look, I mean, with Buckley, I know on race, he held some really, really disturbing views, which he later recanted.
And on sexuality, his famous public debate with Gore Vidal.
Yeah.
John Gantz was on the show a few months ago. His book, When the Clock Broke, has had a big impact, which talks about the intellectual origins, if that's the right word, of the new right in the early 90s, particularly in terms of David Duke. Is there a clannish element to this, Pete?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, David Duke ran in Louisiana back in the 90s.
Right.
And I remember there was a debate in the George H.W. Bush administration at the time. And President Bush was reluctant to speak out against Duke, not because he had any sympathy for Duke. The argument that was being made to him is that you're going to elevate him. He's going to collapse of his own weight. And if you weigh in, it's going to catalyze some supporters for him. And I thought at the time that was not the way to go. And thankfully, Bush did speak out. But Duke was a noted figure. I mean, he was not wildly popular in the Republican Party by any means, but he was, the canary in the coal mine in a sense. There are these figures that you can look back now, and it's a spectrum of figures that indicated that there was some dark elements on the right. Now, a lot of us knew that, but I think felt like they were contained, and they were for much of the history of modern conservatism and the Republican Party.
But Pete, it is worth noting. I mean, Carlson, as I said, his podcast show is number 6, many millions of listeners. There is a significant constituency. I mean, we can go after Duke and Fuentes and Carlson and obviously Trump, but clearly there is a significant, who knows what the numbers are, but many millions of Americans have a degree of sympathy for these racist and anti-Semitic messages, which aren't even coded anymore in people like Fuentes.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree with you at all, Andrew. I think if anything, I probably hold that view more strongly than you do, and I've written about it any number of times.
And particularly, you've written about the evangelical community and its embrace of this.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that this is the coin of the realm on the American right. The energy, the viewers, the interest, the support for these figures there's no such thing as a kind of normal Republican establishment to speak of anymore. It is a completely wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement and the MAGA sensibilities. The worst aspects of the MAGA sensibilities absolutely dominates the Republican Party. Anybody that speaks out against Trump does so at their own risk. Marjorie Taylor Greene did so on the very recently on the Epstein files, and there was some. You've talked about this on your show, so I don't want to relitigate the Epstein files, what that means. My point in raising it here is that Trump turned on Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she now declared that she's not going to run for Congress again because she doesn't want to be primaried. And if Trump turned on her, as he did, and endorsed a different primary opponent, she would have lost. So this is Donald Trump's party. He is the representative man, morally above all. Morally above all.
I mean, morally, I'm not sure that is a controversial word, Pete, isn't it? Morally.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a controversial word, but ethically, in terms of the attitudes and outlooks and sensibilities, how people judge what's good and right and noble and what's worth fighting for and defending and what's worth opposing, however you define that. Donald Trump and the MAGA movement and the people that you listed, J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson and increasingly Fuentes and Candace Owen and Rod Dreher and a lot of others.
Well, that's a big tent when you include Dreher and who was on the show a few years ago. I have to admit I didn't care for him, and Candace Owen in the same sentence. I mean, that covers a lot of intellectual ground, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I need a caveat with Rod Dreher. He's spoken out recently against the anti-Semitism on the right, and I don't think Rod Dreher is in the crazed area that Candace Owen is, but he has been a supporter of Trump and been, if you want to refer to Rod as a intellectual or semi-intellectual, he's been pushing views. He's kind of fallen in love with Viktor Orban in Hungary. That is,
yeah. Didn't he go and live in Hungary?
Yeah, he lives now in Hungary, and he's an advocate for the Hungarian approach, and he writes all the time. He's a serious writer, so he's worth reading and judging. People should make their own judgments on him. And again, I don't think Rod Dreher is in the same category as some of the people, but he is on the MAGA right. He's in part responsible for the rise of Donald Trump, and in some respects, I guess this is one of the points I try and make, which is it's those kind of figures who are responsible for where we are and who are now 10 years into Trump acting at various times with some measure of shock that anti-Semitism has happened, or that Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation would defend Carlson and find themselves, within the anti-Semitic territory and the crazed conspiracy theories and these others, because for 10 years they were essentially anti-Trump or never Trumpers. They spoke out once in a while in a few cases like Rod Dreher, but not often, and it was clear that Rod Dreher supported Trump. I don't think he spoke out nearly soon enough or often enough. And they kind of winked and nodded a lot that was going on. And then you wake up, one day in 2025 and you find out just how dark and ugly this movement is, and they act shocked. And
yeah, it's like the scene in Casablanca when the police officer is informed of the existence of gambling and said, "I'm shocked. I'm terribly shocked." So what's the best intellectual response? One piece of news today in the New York Times is that Trump is pardoning a Central American ex-president who flooded America with cocaine, meanwhile half declaring war on Venezuela, which he claims is supplying drugs to the American streets. The hypocrisy is self-evident. But is there any point, Pete, in even pointing these things out anymore? Because the hypocrisy or the intellectual inconsistency is so self-evident that it doesn't really, firstly, it doesn't seem to make any difference. And secondly, it doesn't seem to change anyone's mind, at least people on his side. Is there any point in pointing out these kind of inconsistencies?
It's a fair question, and I go back and forth on it. I do think that there's a role to play as long as one doesn't obsess on it for the reasons that you said. I mean, you could do this every single day of your life. There are just so many inconsistencies, so many hypocrisies, so many things that don't square. And at some point you could become a broken record at pointing them out. On the other hand, if people don't point it out, then you essentially cede the ground to them. And it's
Mm.
also maybe important that when objective conditions change, as I think they are in this country, and reality is beginning to catch up with the Trump administration. That's why he's down to 36% in the latest Gallup poll. It shows that some people can be reached who did support him. And beyond that, Andrew, this is just my disposition, I would say, as a person and a writer, is it's important to tell the truth, even if you don't succeed in telling the truth. I was influenced early on in my life by people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Soviet dissident, who ended his 1970 Nobel Prize speech, "One word of truth outweighs the whole world," or Václav Havel, the great Czech dissident, later president. And he wrote an essay that you and I may have discussed. I'm sure you're familiar with it, "The Power of the Powerless."
Yeah.
It was written in the late 1970s, where he talked about the importance of living within the truth and not living within the lie. And I think, and these were dissidents in countries that were communist and were totalitarian, and still they told the truth, and still it mattered. And I just think you can't always use as your metric how successful it is. Sometimes you just have to be faithful to what is true and right and
And
good.
faith for you, I think often, Pete, is more important than the intellectual foundations. I mentioned Charles Murray earlier. He's come around to your way of thinking. His last book is on his discovering religion or God. You were there a long time before him and many others. Your essay focuses on Martin Niemöller rather than the intellectual inconsistencies. I think you focus on the spiritual element. Why is Niemöller one of the great critics, perhaps the best known moral critic of Nazism? Why should we remember him in late 2025 in America?
Yeah, it's a good question. I appreciate the question. I would put Bonhoeffer probably as the preeminent Christian critic, but Niemöller as well. I mean, he was a really interesting figure. He's a German theologian and Lutheran pastor who was actually quite encouraged by the rise of Hitler in 1933, and he said that this would end sort of years of darkness that Germany had been in. And Niemöller was also anti-Semitic. Not the worst form of anti-Semitism within Germany at that time because of how ugly it was, but anti-Semitic in a very problematic way. But he broke with Hitler and the Nazi movement, and also the so-called German Christians, who was the pro-Nazi faction within the German Protestant Church. Now, Niemöller broke with them because he felt like that the state was controlling churches and religion. That was his main reason for dissent. And he paid a price for that dissent. He was sent to 2 concentration camps and later a camp in Austria. But the inflection point, and then he was rescued in 1945 by the Americans. But that time in the concentration camps and when he was freed in 45 became an inflection point in his life. And he really came to repent, to use a Christian word, for his views, both toward the Jews and toward Germany more broadly. And he was a key figure in the creation of something called the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, which spoke about the collective guilt among Christians, Protestant Christians, to the Nazi regime. And then he had this famous line, which was a poem, which I can read.
Yeah, first they came, the first they came for, which often gets repeated.
Yeah, and the reason I use that quote is because and Niemöller as an example is because I think it made a certain point, and I made clear that America isn't Nazi Germany and Trump isn't Hitler. But the point, I think, is relevant not just to this country, but in any time, and that is, if you don't speak out at key moments, key moral moments, key ethical moments, key moments in the life of a nation, and you remain silent, and evil spreads, and wickedness spreads, and cruelty spreads, and maliciousness spreads, then you will find yourself over time in a different place than you started. And apropos what we were talking about earlier with, Casablanca and Rick's Cafe, and people wake up one day and they're shocked to see what the country has become or what a movement has become. And it's not a shock. It's because too many people who knew better didn't speak out. They went along to get along. They were afraid. They wanted access to power. A lot of different factors go into it. But at the end of the day, I think that there's a harsh judgment for people who should speak out, even if it comes at some risk to themselves, whether it's professional or financial or even physical. We need people to speak out for truth, and that didn't happen during the last 15, 20 years in the American right, particularly in the last 10 years.
Yeah, as you say, Solzhenitsyn famously argued, one word of truth shall outweigh the whole world. Let's end, Pete, with a tale of two Kellys. There's Mark Kelly from Arizona, who Donald Trump is suggesting should be punishable by death, but he took a strong moral stand when it came to the behavior of American troops overseas. And then another Kelly, a very different Kelly, Megyn Kelly, who has been publicly talking about her torture fantasies for the Venezuelan supposed drug smugglers. This tale of two Kellys, it seems, Pete, speaks to the two Americas, the moral America, or the America that still remains moral, of Mark Kelly, and the America of Megyn Kelly, who at one point seemed a relatively coherent journalist with a degree of moral backbone, but now seems to have degenerated into this just complete insanity.
Yeah, that's a very elegant juxtaposition, the Mark Kelly and the Megyn Kelly. I agree completely with what you said. I think Mark Kelly, who himself has served the country honorably in the military, has spoken out with some measure of courage against what's happening.
And personal and otherwise. I mean, when people are talking about putting me in jail, he already got a letter. I think I heard his interview on CNN this weekend where the FBI has already contacted him. He didn't seem particularly bothered, but it must concern him.
Of course. Anytime the FBI contacts people, it's a level of concern, even if you're completely innocent. So he's speaking out. He's speaking out when there's a cost to speaking out. He's speaking the truth, and he's calling into question what is quite likely a set of illegal actions done by the Trump administration. We have to wait. The fact sets has to come out. But the early evidence is troubling. The way that the Trump administration is acting is troubling. And Megyn Kelly is in some respects, she is the journalistic personification of the Heritage Foundation as an institution, right? Which is something or someone who was once responsible and reasonably thoughtful, even if you disagreed with them, and has found their way into crankdom, into the world of not just lunacy, but really ugly lunacy. And there's a sadistic quality to the comments that Megyn Kelly made.
Yeah, her blood. I mean, it's worse. Kelly is not. You can't compare Kelly with Kevin Roberts at Heritage. I'm not defending Roberts, but it's one thing to defend the right of, I don't know, Tucker Carlson to have Fuentes on a show. It's another to come out publicly with these bloodthirsty fantasies of killing and maiming and torturing foreigners, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think Kevin Roberts has acted in a way that's disgraceful, but not surprising. But I don't think he's gone as far as Megyn Kelly. As you said, there's something slightly, I don't know, darkly deranged in what she was saying.
More than slightly, Pete. I mean,
yeah, no, fair enough. All right, I withdraw the modifier, and that's worth noting because, apropos the conversation that we've had, she is representative of something. She was a serious journalist.
Yeah, she's got a popular podcast show, the Megyn Kelly Show. I mean, it's the new media. I mean, may not be quite as popular as the Carlson Show, but it's watched by many people.
Yeah, and you see where she was. Remember, in the debate in 2015, where she was one of the questioners in the
Right, and Trump
primaries.
famously came out with his blood remark
Yeah,
about her.
yeah. And now, where is she? She's really in the dark precincts, and I'm sure she's making a lot of money, and she's certainly got a lot of listeners, and
Are
she
you
loves.
suggesting that she's doing this to make more money? That she's saying stuff that she knows will create a stir, so that she can drive viewers and listeners to her show, or is there more to it?
Well, it's always hard to tell. I mean, often we don't even know our own motives, let alone describing the motives of other people. I think what we can say reasonably about Megyn Kelly is where she is now and where she was 10 years ago is profoundly different. And she's become foul-mouthed, and she's now engaging in sadistic kind of comments in ways that there was no evidence that she was doing earlier. And it's just an observational fact. Maybe it's more than an observational fact, but it is an observational fact that she's, succeeding. She's getting a lot of attention. We're talking about her. A lot of other people are talking about her. She's got a lot of people who listen to her, and she is liked and celebrated within MAGA world. And MAGA world has a lot of influence, and she has power in a way that people like me don't. And so, life is probably in many respects good for her. Now, whether she can rationalize what she's saying or not, well, I don't think she can rationalize, but whether she's telling herself stories to justify to herself that this stuff is defensible, I don't know, because I don't know her. But I don't need to know her. It's enough just to judge on what she's saying publicly and to note the downward trajectory that she's been on. And I'd say, in the context of this larger discussion, it's not unusual. She is representative of something that has happened that I think symbolizes the intellectual and moral decline of the American right.
Well, there you have it. The intellectual and moral decline of the American right by, I always call him the conservative conscience of America, Pete Wehner. He's been writing about this stuff now for many years. He's prescient and brave, Pete. I'm not sure if we'll talk again before the end of the year. Happy holidays, happy new year, and keep doing your important work. You may not have the viewers of a Megyn Kelly or even a Nick Fuentes, but I think you're much more important in terms of the long-term future, certainly the moral future of this country. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. It's always a delight